The cry beneath the iron sky. The spaceport of Vierxel Prime had never known silence. It was a constructed continent of alloy and light suspended beneath a bruised violet sky. Atmospheric stabilizers hummed like distant thunder. Incoming freighters tore through cloud cover in streaks of white plasma, their descent thrusters igniting the heavens in controlled fire. Massive cargo lifters stalked across docking lanes on articulated legs, shrieking as they transferred containers large enough to house small cities. Traders barked numbers, threats, and prayers in 100 languages that overlapped in one unending tide of sound. The air tasted of ozone, scorched metal, and exotic spices spilled from cracked merchant crates. Warning klaxons wailed, docking clamps thundered shut. Somewhere, something exploded in a legal and entirely insured fashion. Above it all rose the black spires of the Draconic Imperium's administrative citadel. They pierced the clouds like obsidian spears, each tower etched with glowing runes that pulsed with ancient power. The sigil of the coiled star serpent shimmered across the skyline, a symbol older than most civilizations currently trading below it. This was the capital world, the beating heart of a stellar empire. It was ruled by Empress Seralith. Her name was spoken with reverence, fear, and sometimes trembling all across thousands of systems. It was said her wings could eclipse a battle cruiser in flight, that her fire had once split a rebellious moon into molten rings, that she remembered stars before they were catalogued. And yet, none of that prepared the spaceport for the sound that followed. At first it was mistaken for a malfunction, a high-pitched interference squeal cutting through channel frequencies, a faulty pressure valve screaming on docking ring 7. But the sound did not cycle or fade. It trembled, hitched, broke, and rose again in raw, piercing distress. It was crying. Infant crying. The impossible clarity of it sliced through engine roars and plasma arcs as though the universe itself had lowered its volume in deference. Conversations died mid-syllable. Hydraulic arms froze in half-motion. Even the atmospheric hum seemed to quiet as if wary. Every being on docking ring 7 turned toward the source. There, in the open center of the docking ring, where cargo was inspected and tariffs were imposed, sat a cradle. It had not been there seconds before. No ship manifest listed its arrival, no drone recorded its placement, it simply existed. The cradle was wrought from imperial gold, no imitation alloy but true draconic aurum mined from the molten hearts of conquered worlds. Its surface shimmered with etched constellations that shifted subtly when viewed from different angles. Along its rim coiled the sigil of the star serpent, inlaid with crushed starlight crystal. Inside it, the crying continued. Dock workers inhaled sharply as the scent reached them. Royal flame, ancient starlight, bloodlines. A cluster of scaled merchants immediately dropped to one knee. A towering six-armed cargomaster bowed so low his forehead struck the metal floor. Even species unfamiliar with draconic hierarchy felt instinctive dread ripple down their spines. This was no abandoned hatchling. This was the heir. The Empress's child. The realization struck like a gravitational collapse. No one moved. No one dared. To approach the bloodline without sanction was treason. To interfere with a royal heir was extinction, not just of oneself, but possibly one's species. The Draconic Imperium was not known for measured responses where its sovereignty was concerned. The hatchlings' cries intensified, echoing off the curved metal architecture. Tiny plumes of smoke puffed from within the cradle, the air shimmered with heat distortion. A brave or foolish, long-limbed clerk leaned just enough to peer over the rim. He recoiled instantly. The infant dragon was newly hatched, scales not yet fully hardened. They shimmered like molten sunrise, soft crimson fatting into gold at the edges. Small horns, pale as polished ivory, curved gently from her brow. Her wings were translucent membranes threaded with glowing veins of embryonic fire. Each sob sent sparks skittering across the floor. And still, no one moved. A trio of Imperial observers stood frozen near the docking control tower. Their crests flared with agitation, but protocol chained their limbs. If this was a test, interference would mean disgrace. If it was a political maneuver, touching the air could ignite civil war. The crying sharpened, desperate now. It was not the roar of a dragon's. It was the helpless, broken sound of something small and alone. Across the ring, in Bay 12, a human mechanic slid out from beneath a cargo shuttle with a wrench between his teeth. Jonah Hale spat the wrench into his palm and wiped grease across an already stained sleeve. He had been halfway through recalibrating a gravitic stabilizer when the crying reached him. He paused, frowned. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," he muttered to the empty bay. The crying came again. Jonah stood slowly. Humans were not native to Viraxel Prime. They were tolerated, sometimes respected, but rarely central to imperial affairs. Their species had entered galactic politics comparatively recently, armed with stubborn resilience and a tendency to survive things that should have killed them twice. Jonah was not an ambassador or a soldier. He fixed things. Broken engines, ruptured coolant lines, occasionally broken pride. He stepped out into the docking ring and saw the crowd. And the cradle. And the smoke curling upward. A scaled dockworker hissed sharply. "Do not approach," it whispered urgently. "That is death." Jonah squinted. "It's a baby. It is the Empress's heir." He blinked once. "Still a baby." The crying hitched again, high and shattering. Something in Jonah's chest tightened painfully. He had never had children, never planned to. Spaceports were not ideal environments for raising anything softer than a cactus, but there was a universal truth he understood without cultural translation. If something that small was crying like that, it needed help. He walked forward, and a collective gasp rippled through the docking ring. "Humans, stop," someone croaked. Jonah ignored them. Each step felt strangely loud against the metal flooring. Heat intensified with proximity. The air shimmered around the cradle, distorting light like a miniature sun burned within. He crouched. Up close, the craftsmanship of the cradle was staggering. Protective wards shimmered faintly along its edges. Ancient draconic script glowed in protective spirals. Inside, the hatchling writhed in distress. Golden eyes snapped open. They locked onto his. Time seemed to hold its breath. The infant's pupils narrowed to slits. A small burst of flame sputtered from her mouth and licked across Jonah's sleeve. The fabric blackened instantly. Jonah looked down at it. "Okay," he said calmly, "we're establishing boundaries, good start." The crying faltered, not stopped but startled. He leaned closer, voice dropping. "Hey there, little furnace," he murmured. "You sound like you lost your whole fleet." The hatchling blinked. Another hiccup sob escaped her. Up above, unseen by mortal eyes, surveillance spells activated. The throne chamber miles above in the citadel flickered with images drawn from scrying lenses. Empress Seralith lifted her head. She felt it through the bond before she saw it. Her child's fear. Her child's distress. And a presence beside her. Mortal. Warm. Unafraid. Back on docking ring 7, Jonah extended his hands slowly. The heat intensified sharply as he breached the cradle's inner ward. It was like placing his arms inside a working reactor core. The skin along his forearms flushed red instantly. A murmur swept the watching crowd. "He will burn. He will die." The hatchling flailed weakly. Jonah slid his hands beneath her small body and lifted. For a split second, the air exploded with light. The infant's defensive fire surged instinctively, washing over his arms in a burst hot enough to warp the cradle's rim. Gasps turned into cries. And then, nothing. No scream. No ash. Jonah stood upright with a dragon infant cradled awkwardly against his chest. Smoke curled lazily from his sleeves. His forearms were red, but unburned. Humans were fragile in bone density compared to several species present. Their lifespans were laughably short by imperial standards. Their political structures were chaotic. But they were stubbornly heat-tolerant creatures from a death world orbiting an angry star. Jonah shifted the hatchling slightly, supporting her neck. "There we go," he murmured. The infant stared up at him. Her tiny claws flexed uncertainly. Then slowly, one claw latched onto the collar of his grease-streaked jumpsuit. The crying dwindled into soft, confused whimpers. Jonah rocked slightly on instinct, a motion remembered from a childhood he barely thought about anymore. "Yeah," he whispered, "big scary universe out there." The hatchling's wings trembled once. Her eyes slid closed. The last hiccup faded. Silence descended across docking ring 7 with a weight greater than any freighter. The Empress's child slept. Against a human mechanic. No lightning struck. No imperial guard descended in righteous fury. Instead, High above in the throne chamber carved from living obsidian, Empress Seralith watched through scrying flame. Her vast form coiled around the throne of cosmic iron. Galaxies shimmered within her scales like distant memories. Advisors knelt in anxious silence, awaiting command. She did not move. She studied the human. His posture was protective but not possessive. His scent carried no ambition, no hunger for power, only mild confusion and a stubborn, protective warmth. Her ancient heart, older than some star systems, shifted. Through the bond, she felt her daughter's fear receding. Replacing it. Comfort. Seralith's talons tightened slightly against the throne arm. A test had been set in motion by factions within her court, whispers that humanity was weak, that they lacked the spine to stand beneath dragonfire, that they survived by luck and numbers alone. She had permitted the test. She had not expected this. Down below, Jonah exhaled slowly, adjusting the sleeping hatchling as if holding a sack of precious, extremely warm potatoes. He looked around at the stunned crowd. What? He asked quietly. Somebody get me a blanket or something, she's overheating. No one moved. They were too busy recalibrating their understanding of reality. In the hush of that impossible moment, something subtle shifted in the Imperium. A narrative cracked. A certainty faltered. Because under the iron sky of Vyarxel Prime, beneath the gaze of dragons and stars, when the Empress's baby cried, it had not been a warlord who answered. Not a nobles. Not a priest of ancient flame. It had been a human mechanic with grease on his hands and absolutely no regard for imperial suicide laws. And in the throne chamber above, Empress Seralith, flame of 10,000 suns, sovereign of the draconic Imperium, turned her ancient gaze toward docking ring 7 and smiled. The fire that tested steel. Jonah Hale did not know he was being watched. He did not know that ancient scrying lenses had locked onto the heat signature of his repair bay. He did not know that 3 separate noble houses had gathered in private chambers to observe what they assumed would be a very brief and very educational death. He did not know that the Empress herself had narrowed her ancient gaze upon docking ring 7. He only knew that someone, some idiot with authority, had left a royal-looking dragon baby unattended in the loudest spaceport in 3 galaxies. And that was unacceptable by any species' standards. His repair bay was not designed for royalty. It smelled of ionized coolant and burnt wiring insulation. Half-disassembled thruster assemblies lay scattered across steel worktables. Diagnostic screens flickered with schematics and warning symbols. A battered mug labeled World's Okayest Mechanic steamed beside a fusion welder. In the center of this mechanical chaos sat the heir to the draconic Imperium. Wrapped snugly in a thermal containment blanket rated for overheating reactor cores. The hatchling had stopped crying entirely. Instead, she lay on her back across Jonah's lap, happily gnawing on a titanium torque wrench nearly as long as her forearm. The metal squealed faintly under tiny, surprisingly powerful teeth. Jonah tilted his head, observing. Okay, that's either impressive or very concerning for future furniture, he muttered. The hatchling chirped in response, a bright, pleased sound that vibrated faintly with internal heat. Small curls of smoke drifted lazily upward from her nostrils. The heat inside the bay had risen by at least 10 degrees despite ventilation systems working overtime. Outside the half-open bay doors, dock workers clustered in nervous knots. They whispered in hushed, urgent tones. She lives. The human still breathes. Has the Empress struck him down yet? One particularly dramatic reptilian merchant insisted this was clearly the beginning of a prophecy, and demanded someone fetch ceremonial drums. Jonah ignored them. He adjusted the blanket gently around the hatchling's shoulders. Beneath the fabric, he could feel steady warmth, like holding a living furnace that purred instead of roared. He studied her more closely now that she was calm. Her scales shimmered subtly between crimson and molten gold depending on the angle of light. They were soft, not yet hardened into the armored plate's adult dragon's bore. Fine veins of luminescent energy pulsed faintly beneath the surface of her wings, like contained lightning waiting for direction. Her eyes were enormous compared to her face, gold, luminous, and intensely aware. They tracked him constantly. There was intelligence there. New and forming. But sharp. Yeah, Jonah murmured quietly, you're going to be trouble. The hatchling squeaked in what could only be interpreted as agreement. Then, The temperature dropped. Not gradually, not naturally. It plunged. Jonah's breath fogged faintly despite the hatchling's heat. The diagnostic screens flickered, static crawling across their surfaces. Overhead lights dimmed as though something vast and heavy had stepped between the bay and the sun. The whispering outside ceased. A shadow stretched across the hangar floor. Metal groaned. Not from heat this time. From pressure. Jonah slowly looked toward the entrance. A shape filled it. She did not enter in her true form. That would have annihilated half the docking ring simply by existing at scale. Instead, she reduced herself to something merely enormous by mortal standards. 3 meters tall. Crowned in obsidian horns that curved backward like carved night. Her scales were darker than space between galaxies, edged in veins of glowing magmalite. Wings folded neatly behind her back, their membranes shimmering with restrained cosmic fire. Starfare wreathed her form, not wild but controlled, contained power, the kind that did not need to roar to be understood. Empress Sarilith, sovereign of the Draconic Imperium. Flame of 10,000 suns. Her presence was not loud. It was absolute. Gravity itself seemed to lean toward her. Jonah blinked once. The hatchling froze mid-gnaw. Then her face lit up. She squealed in delight and flapped her tiny wings so hard that sparks scattered across the bay floor. Jonah looked down at hers. Then back up at the towering dragon. Then back at the babies. Well, he said carefully, I'm guessing your mom. The Empress took one step forward. The floor cracked beneath her claw. Not violently. Just enough to make a point. Her molten gaze settled first on Jonah. Then on her daughters. The air thickened. You hold, Sarilith said, her voice layered, one tone audible, another resonating somewhere deeper in bone and memory, what empires would slaughter for. Jonah shifted the hatchling slightly higher on his hip, as she attempted to chew his collar now that the wrench had been confiscated. Yeah, he said, I gathered that. Explain. The word was not shouted. It did not need to be. Jonah considered the question seriously. He did not bow, not out of disrespect. He simply did not seem to process the necessity. She was crying, he said plainly. Silence fell like a guillotine. Outside the bay, 3 noble observers stiffened in outrage. Inside, the Empress's eyes narrowed a fraction. You risk annihilation, she said slowly, because she cried. Jonah shrugged slightly, careful not to jostle the hatchling. That's generally how bobbies work. The hatchling chose that exact moment to grab his chin with both tiny claws and yank his face downward with shocking strength. Jonah stumbled half a step. She chirped triumphantly. He left. Actually left. The sound was warm and unguarded. Sarilith watched him with ancient stillness. Dragons understood fear intimately. It had been their currency for millennia. Entire civilizations had bent knee beneath the mere rumor of draconic displeasure. This human did not smell of fear. There was adrenaline, yes, elevated heart rate, stress. But not terror. Not submission. Only steady defiance wrapped in dry humor. You do not fear me, Sarilith observed. Jonah met her gaze evenly. Ma'am, he replied, I fix warp cores that explode if I sneeze wrong. Fear and I have an understanding. It shows up, I nod, we get the job done. The hatchling tugged his hair approvingly. Sarilith's pupils thinned. He was not posturing. He simply was. Humans. Fragile skeletal structure compared to many species. Lifespans that blinked by like sparks. Political alliances that shifted like unstable plasma. And yet, they survived Deathworld storms. They endured radiation levels that would cripple lesser species. They bonded to things outside themselves with alarming ferocity. Sarilith inhaled slowly. There was no grade in his scent. No ambitions. No hunger for leverage. Only irritation that someone had failed basic childcare protocol. And protective instinct. It radiated from him like low, steady heat. My daughter was placed here intentionally, Sarilith said at last. Jonah's eyebrows rose. Intentionally. Oh yes. The word carried weight. There are factions within my court, she continued, who believe humanity weak. soft, dependent upon alliance rather than inherent strength. Jonah glanced down at the hatchling, who had now seized his wrench again and was attempting to bend it experimentally. That tracks, he said. They proposed a test, Sarilith continued. If the heir of the Imperium were left vulnerable among humans, would any dare act, or would they look away, fearing consequence? Outside the bay, several watching nobles shifted uncomfortably. Jonah absorbed that information. He looked at the baby, then at the Empress, then back at the baby. Seems like a weird job interview, he said. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft metallic crunch of titanium under infant dragon teeth. Then, the Empress's lips curved. It was not a human smile. It revealed rows of diamond-like fangs. But it was unmistakably amusement. You have passed, she said. The words rippled outward. Across scrying chambers. Across noble halls. Across the very foundation of certain political expectations. In a private observation balcony above Docking Ring 7, two high-ranking draconic nobles fainted dead away. Inside the repair bay, Jonah blinked. Past what exactly? The test, Sarilith replied. Is there a prize? The hatchling chirped and launched herself upward, flapping her tiny wings. Jonah barely caught her before she headbutted the Empress's chest scales. Sarilith lowered her head slightly, allowing her daughter to nuzzle against her jawline. The shift in her presence was subtle but profound. The crushing weight of imperial authority eased. Replaced by something older. Something primal. A mother. She touched her daughter's forehead gently with one claw. Through their bond, she felt contentment, warmth, security. The human had given her child something no political faction had anticipated. Immediate comfort. Without calculation. Without hesitation. Sarilith lifted her gaze back to Jonah. Many would have knelt, she said quietly. Many would have fled. Yeah, Jonah agreed, that's usually how giant space dragons work. A faint rumble vibrated in her chest. Laughter. Low, dangerous, real. You are either very brave, she observed, or catastrophically foolish. Jonah considered that. Those aren't mutually exclusive. The hatchling squealed again and promptly attempted to climb up Sarilith's horn. Jonah instinctively steadied her from below without thinking. Sarilith noticed. He did not withdraw his hand quickly, as though burned by proximity to imperial flesh. He simply ensured the baby did not fall. Even now. Even knowing exactly who stood before him. Interesting. Human Jonah Hale, Sarilith said, tasting his name like a new alloy. What would you have done had I chosen to incinerate you where you stand? Jonah shrugged lightly. Probably complain about it. She tilted her head. You joke in the face of death. I cope in the face of death, he corrected gently. The hatchling suddenly sneezed. A small burst of flame shot sideways, igniting a stack of coolant rags. Jonah sighed and kicked a suppression foam canister toward it without looking. The foam deployed instantly, dousing the fire. Sarilith stared at him. You anticipated that. She's tithing. There was a long pause. Then slowly, Sarilith straightened to her full reduced height. Her wings unfurled slightly, not in threat but declaration. You have demonstrated, she said, voice resonating outward beyond the bay, that humanity does not require flame to prove its strength. Outside, every listening noble stiffened. Strength, she continued, is not measured solely in dominance. Her gaze remained fixed on Jonah. It is measured in who answers the cry of the helpless. Silence fell across Docking Ring 7. Across the Citadel. Across every chamber where this moment was being witnessed. The test had not gone as expected. It had gone better. Sarilith extended one claw. Jonah hesitated only a second before gently transferring the hatchling back into her mother's arms. The infant protested immediately, grabbing at Jonah's sleeve. He chuckled softly. Hey, Furnace, you've got bigger claws to chew on. Sarilith observed the exchange carefully. Her daughter did not cry. She did not flare in distress. She simply blinked between them. Secure. The Empress inclined her head slightly. Not a bow, but unmistakable acknowledgement. Humanity will be reevaluated within my court, she declared. Jonah rubbed the back of his neck. Cool. And you, she added, eyes glinting, will be summoned. His hand froze. Summoned? Oh yes. For what? Sarilith's fanged smile returned. That, she said softly, will depend on whether you continue to answer when called. And with that, starfire flared. Light consumed the bay. When it faded, the Empress and her daughter were gone. The temperature normalized. The light steadied. Metal stopped groaning. Jonah stood alone in his repair bay. The foam canister hissed quietly in the corner. Outside, dock workers stared at him as though he had personally arm-wrestled a supernova. He looked down at the half-melted wrench in his hand. Well, he muttered, that escalated. Far above, in the throne chamber of obsidian and stars, Empress Sarilith settled upon her throne once more. Around her, nobles trembled in uncertain recalculation. She closed her eyes briefly and smiled. The fire had tested steel, and the steel had not melted. The mechanic of the dragon thrones. Word spread across the Imperium in hours. It did not creep quietly through diplomatic channels or slither through back-alley rumor networks. It detonated. From Viraxel Prime's capital spires to frontier mining colonies carved into asteroid belts, the message traveled on quantum relays and flame-coded transmissions. A human mechanic had held the heir of the dragon throne. And lived. Not only lived. Been acknowledged. The distinction mattered. Survival could be accident. Acknowledgement was intent. Across noble houses, ancient dragons uncoiled from meditation pools of plasma and ash. In war chambers orbiting red giants, admirals paused mid-strategy projection. On distant colonial outposts where hatchlings learned to shape their first sparks, instructors replayed the surveillance footage in stunned silence. There he was. Jonah hailed. Grease on his sleeve. Hair slightly singed. Holding the future of the Imperium like an overheating engine part that required gentle calibration. The image unsettled centuries of assumption. Humans had been categorized as useful, adaptable, tolerable, but minors. They were not ancient, they did not command starfare, they did not live long enough to accumulate the weight of millennia. And yet, one of them had walked into Dragonfire because a child was crying. Within a full Imperial cycle, 27 standard hours, Jonah Hale received a summons. He read it twice, then once more for good measure. The Imperial seal shimmered holographically above the message pad, coiling Star Serpent blazing in gold. You are commanded to appear before the celestial court of Viraxel Prime, the summons read, by decree of Her Radiant Majesty, Empress Sarilith. Jonah stared at it. Well, he muttered to himself, that's not ominous at all. The celestial court of Viraxel Prime was not designed with human proportions in mind. It was vast, an architectural declaration of draconic supremacy. The chamber was carved into the core of the capital's highest spire, its walls formed from black cosmic stone veined with slow-moving magmalite. The ceiling arched impossibly high, opening into a transparent dome through which the violet sky and drifting stars were visible even in daylight. Pillars shaped like entwined dragons rose along the perimeter, each large enough to dwarf a capital ship's engine column. Between them lay tiers of ascending platforms upon which noble dragons gathered in resplendent, intimidating formation. Their wings bore scars from supernova wars. Their horns were etched with lineage sigils older than humanity's recorded history. Their eyes gleamed like molten suns or cold, distant quasars. And in the center of it all, a small, rectangular platform had been installed. At human height, Jonah stood on it. He felt severely underdressed. His cleanest jumpsuit still bore faint scorch marks on the sleeves. He had attempted to polish his boots. The effort had been optimistic. He resisted the urge to look up too quickly. There were a lot of teeth in this room. At the far end of the chamber rose the dragon throne. Forged from cosmic iron harvested from collapsed stars, it radiated quiet, contained power. Starfare flowed through carved channels along its structure, pulsing like a heartbeat. The sigil of the Imperium shimmered above it in suspended light. Upon it rested Empress Sarilith. Today, she did not reduce herself to 3 meters. She occupied her true, magnificent scale, coiled in regal power, wings folded like vast night sky banners behind her. Each breath she exhaled carried a faint shimmer of solar flame. Beside her, perched on a lower extension of the throne, Princess Calith. The hatchling scales gleamed brighter now, polished and adorned with delicate golden threads marking her status as heir. Her horns had grown a fraction. Her wings fluttered in curious excitement. And she was not sitting calmly. She was watching the entrance. Watching him. A herald's voice boomed across the chamber. Jonah Hale of Terra, mechanic of Docking Ring 7, stands before the celestial court by imperial summons. The sound reverberated through stone and bone alike. Jonah cleared his throat. Highs he offered. A ripple of disapproval hissed from several tiers. Princess Calith squealed in delight. Before anyone could react, she launched herself from the throne platform. Gasps erupted. A blur of crimson and gold shot through the air. Directly toward Jonah. He barely had time to brace before the hatchling collided with his chest and scrambled up his shoulder with enthusiastic claws. "Whoa, hey, careful with the eyes," he muttered, steadying her instinctively. She chirped happily and wrapped her small body around his upper torso like a living, glowing scarf. A scandalized noble dragon flared his wings. "The air does not cling to." He stopped speaking when the princess puffed a small, defiant cloud of smoke directly at him. Jonah patted her gently. "Easy, furnace." On the throne, Saralith's expression did not change. But her tail flicked once in unmistakable amusement. The court gradually fell silent again. Saralith rose. When she unfolded her wings, the chamber darkened. "Let all present bear witness," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly to every tier, "to the event that has stirred our Imperium." Her gaze swept across ancient warlords, scholars, admirals. "Strength," she declared, "is not measured in flame alone." The words echoed. Some nobles shifted uneasily. "It is measured," she continued, "in who answers the cry of the helpless." Her eyes locked briefly on Jonah, then swept outward again. "My daughter was placed in vulnerability, a test devised by those who questioned the resolve of humanity." A subtle tension rippled through certain sections of the court. They expected hesitation. Silence. They expected fear. A pause. They did not anticipate compassion. Jonah adjusted slightly as Calith attempted to chew his collar again. Saralith extended one massive claw toward him, not in threat but in acknowledgement. This human walked into Dragonfire not for glory, not for leverage, not for advantage. Her voice deepened. "He acted because a child cried." The chamber held its breath. "Therefore," Saralith proclaimed, "let it be decreed. Humanity shall no longer be considered a minor species within our borders." A shockwave of murmurs erupted instantly. Saralith's wings flared once. Silence snapped back into place. "They shall be recognized as Ironhearts." The word resonated differently. Ancient. Intentional. "Those who walk into Dragonfire not because they believe they will survive," she said, "but because someone needed them." The declaration rippled outward like a supernova pulse. Across political councils. Across military alliances. Across every ledger that categorized humanity as peripheral. Jonah leaned slightly toward the throne, careful not to dislodge Calith. "So does this come with healthcare?" he asked quietly. The nearest tier of nobles stiffened in horror. Princess Calith squeaked in delighted approval. For a long, suspended moment, the celestial court remained frozen. Then, a low rumble began in Saralith's chest. It grew, rolled, expanded into full-bodied laughter that shook the pillars. And impossibly, other dragons joined. It started with a few. Then more. Ancient warlords who had once burned fleets found themselves rumbling in amusement. Scholars hid smiles behind folded wings. Even the scandalized noble who had been smoked earlier emitted a reluctant chuff. For the first time in millennia, laughter rolled freely through the dragon court. It changed the air. Not weaker, but lighter. Jonah blinked. "Okay," he muttered, "that's new." When the laughter subsided, Saralith regarded him thoughtfully. "You will serve," she said. Jonah's eyebrows rose. "In what capacity exactly?" She inclined her head slightly toward the princess, currently attempting to untangle his hair. As guardian to the heir, the chamber erupted in alarms. A human cannot. This is unprecedented. Sarilith's gaze silenced them instantly. The bond has already formed, she said simply. All eyes turned to Calith's. The hatchling had curled comfortably against Jonah's shoulder, tail draped around his arm. Her eyes were half closed in contentment. Dragons understood bonding. It was not granted lightly. It was not easily severed. Jonah exhaled slowly. Respectfully, he began, I fix engines. You will continue to do so, Sarilith replied. The court blinked. You will fix what is broken, she continued, whether machinery or expectation. The weight of that settled heavily. Jonah looked down at Calith. She blinked sleepily up at him. He sighed. Do I at least get a manual? You will receive instruction, Sarilith said. Paid. A faint glint touched her eyes. Oh, yes. Okay, he said, then we're negotiating. Another ripple of restrained amusement moved through the court. The decree was formalized in flame script across the chamber walls. Ancient runes shifted to include a new title in Imperial lexicon. Human Guardian of the Dragon Heirs. From that day forward, it became tradition within the Imperium. When a hatchling cried, whether in a frontier station orbiting a dying star or in a mining colony carved from ice, someone would answer. Protocols changed. Drills were rewritten. Compassion was codified alongside strength. Often, that someone was human. Not because they were commanded, but because they stepped forward. In the years that followed, stories spread of Ironhearts who shielded hatchlings during reactor breaches, of human engineers who designed safer incubation chambers, of cross-species teams trained not merely in combat but in care. The political ramifications were immense. Trade alliances deepened. Military cooperation strengthened. But beneath all the strategic advantages lay something simpler. A shift in perception. Humanity was no longer minor. They were unpredictable, annoyingly brave, disarmingly sincere. In the heart of the Dragon Empire, beside a throne forged in cosmic fire, a grease-stained mechanic took up residence in a set of chambers awkwardly scaled for someone his height. He installed tool racks. He modified temperature regulators. He requested successfully a health benefits package. Princess Calith grew. Her wings strengthened. Her flame brightened. And through it all, she remained stubbornly attached to the human who had answered her first cry beneath the iron sky. Legends formed as they always did. Some painted Jonah as a fearless hero who stared down a cosmic tyrant. He would have disagreed. He had not sought glory. He had not challenged destiny. He had simply heard a baby crying. And responded. In time, when Princess Calith would ascend the dragon throne, chroniclers would record many titles for her reign. Flamebearer, Starforged Sovereign, Unifier of Systems. But in private moments, in the quiet hours before dawn, she would remember something simpler. The smell of grease and metal. The steady rhythm of a human heartbeat. And the day an entire empire learned that strength was not measured in flame alone. Thus the legend of the mechanic of the dragon throne endured. Not as a warrior, not as a conqueror, but as the first Ironheart, the first human guardian of the dragon heir. And proof that sometimes the bravest thing in the galaxy is simply to answer.